At 5:42 on the 15th of June, 1944, the first light is just beginning to lift over Saipan's western shore. The sea is a dark sheet of metal beyond the reef, and the horizon is crowded with silhouettes that do not belong to the island. Offshore, the air carries a low, steady thunder that never quite stops, as if the morning itself has been torn open. In a shallow position, dug into coral-stiff ground above the approaches to Charan Kanoa, a Japanese battalion officer lies awake with his men. The night has left everything damp. Uniforms, rifle stocks, the straps that cut into shoulders. Salt hangs on the lips. Powder smoke drifts in thin layers, mixing with the smell of crushed vegetation and hot stone. He has not slept. Not because he is afraid of dying, but because he is afraid of making the one decision that will follow him into whatever comes after. He listens for runners, for field phones that may no longer work, for the exact tone of distant impacts that tells him whether the next shells are searching or settling. In the gray half-light, he checks the line again in his mind. Each squad, each machine gun, each patch of ground that cannot be surrendered without meaning something larger than tactics. He can feel the moment closing in, like a door with no handle on his side. The officer commanding the battalion on Saipan was a product of a system that had spent decades shaping men to think in a very precise way. At the military academy and later in field training, he had been taught that retreat was not simply a tactical movement. It was a moral failure. To abandon ground was to abandon duty. To survive by yielding was to survive without honor. Bushido, once a personal code of conduct, had been transformed into doctrine. Loyalty was measured not by outcomes, but by endurance. Victory was not defined as holding terrain or preserving forces, but as proving the unbreakable will of the soldier. In this framework, flexibility was weakness, and withdrawal was indistinguishable from collapse. By 1944, these ideas were no longer abstract. They had been drilled into muscle memory. Orders were expected to be obeyed without interpretation. Initiative existed only within the boundaries of sacrifice. The officer knew how to maneuver men. He knew how to calculate fields of fire. He knew how to read terrain. But he had also learned something else, more powerful than any map, that a commander who ordered retreat would be remembered forever, regardless of circumstance. On Saipan, that weight pressed down on him from all sides. He was responsible not only for his men's lives, but for their deaths, how they would be judged, how their families would be told, how their sacrifice would be framed. To withdraw under American pressure would mean surviving with a stain that no later explanation could erase. There were moments, even then, when doubt crept in. He could see the scale of the American landings. He could hear the density of naval fire, the disciplined rhythm of it. This was not the enemy imagined in pre-war lectures, soft, impatient, unwilling to bleed. This enemy advanced methodically, absorbing losses without breaking, replacing units as if from an endless reserve. Yet doubt did not equal permission to act. To question the doctrine was to question the foundation of his identity as an officer. And so when the situation began to deteriorate, his instinct was not to adapt, but to hold, to endure, to prove that the lessons he had lived by still mattered in a world that was rapidly proving otherwise. He believed that by standing firm, he was fulfilling his role. He believed that resolve could still shape the outcome. He believed that if the line did not move, history might hesitate. But history does not hesitate. The island, the enemy, and the war itself were already moving past him. By the third day of the landings, the reality of Saipan could no longer be misunderstood. Saipan was not a fortress in depth. It was a narrow, uneven strip of land with little room to bend without breaking. Coral ridges ran like shallow scars across the island, offering cover that looked solid from a distance but shattered under sustained fire. There were no wide plains to trade space for time, no forests deep enough to hide a withdrawal. Every position, once fixed, became visible. Every trench, once discovered, became a target. Offshore, American naval guns worked with clinical patience. This was not bombardment meant to terrify. It was bombardment meant to erase. Fire was adjusted by observation aircraft, corrected in real time, tightened until entire sections of ground ceased to exist as fighting positions. What could not be destroyed outright was sealed off, isolated, and reduced later. On land, the American advance moved with a rhythm unfamiliar to Japanese defenders. Infantry did not rush. Tanks did not charge blindly. Units paused, called for fire, advanced again. Losses were absorbed, formations reformed, pressure reapplied. The assault did not surge forward in moments of bravery. It rolled forward steadily, without emotion. For the Japanese battalion, the contrast was devastating. Supplies were already low. Communication lines were fragile, cut repeatedly by shelling. Positions had been prepared for defense, but not for maneuver. Once committed, each company was anchored to ground that could not be abandoned without orders that would never come. Reports filtered in from neighboring sectors. Strong points that had been expected to hold for weeks were collapsing in days. Units that had fought to the last man had not slowed the American timetable in any meaningful way. Gaps began to open, not dramatic breakthroughs, but quiet absences where entire formations had ceased to exist. Still, there was a window. Narrow, dangerous, but real. A controlled withdrawal inland could have shortened the line. Forces could have been redistributed. Some men could have been preserved for a later phase of the battle. The terrain allowed for this, barely, but only if the decision was made early, before American armor and artillery fully synchronized their advance. The officer could see it. He understood the map. He knew the cost of waiting. But every hour that passed without explicit permission hardened the situation. What began as a choice slowly transformed into a test. And in the logic he had been taught, tests were not meant to be passed through retreat. As American fire crept closer and the ground itself began to change shape under bombardment, the situation on Saipan narrowed to a single question, one that no amount of courage could avoid. Was holding the line still a defense, or had it already become a sentence? The decision did not arrive as a single dramatic order. It emerged in fragments, missed opportunities, delayed signals, choices made by omission rather than command. By the time the American advance reached the outer edges of the battalion's positions, the officer understood that the window was closing. Communication with higher headquarters was sporadic. Field phones went silent for hours at a time. Runners did not return. What guidance existed came from doctrine, not from the situation unfolding in front of him. On paper, several options still existed. A withdrawal under cover of darkness could have reduced exposure to naval fire. A redistribution of forces might have allowed the battalion to form a shorter, denser line. Even a limited fallback could have preserved cohesion. None of these actions required abandoning the fight, only redefining where it would be fought. But each option carried a meaning that went beyond tactics. To pull back without explicit orders would be interpreted as weakness. To relocate without permission would imply doubt. And doubt in the system he served was more dangerous than annihilation. A commander who held his ground and was destroyed had fulfilled his duty. A commander who survived by yielding had not. The officer weighed these realities not as abstract theory, but as personal consequence. He knew how reports would be written. He knew how his actions would be judged by superiors who were not present, and by a military culture that measured loyalty by sacrifice. He knew that retreat, even if militarily sound, would mark him permanently. So he chose certainty. The orders that went out were simple, almost calm. Positions were to be held. No fallback lines were to be prepared. Units were to conserve ammunition and brace for continued bombardment. The ground they occupied was to be defended as if it were the last ground that mattered. In that moment, the battle ceased to be fluid. The battalion's fate was fixed in place, mapped onto coordinates that American observers were already refining. What had been a living formation became a set of targets, each one waiting its turn. The officer did not believe he was sacrificing his men needlessly. He believed he was anchoring the defense. He believed that if his battalion did not break, the enemy would be forced to slow, to pay, to reconsider. He believed that endurance itself could still impose cost. But the war he was fighting no longer rewarded endurance in isolation. Once the decision was made, there was no dramatic collapse, only an irreversible alignment of events. Artillery schedules tightened, tank routes were adjusted. The American advance did not change pace because it did not need to. The battalion had chosen to stand still in a war designed to destroy anything that did. From that point forward, the outcome was no longer a question of courage or discipline. It was a matter of time. The destruction did not come all at once. It arrived in layers. American artillery began by stripping away concealment. Trees vanished. Camouflage nets burned. Shallow trenches collapsed into themselves, turning prepared positions into open scars in the ground. What remained was not cover, but markers, places where men had chosen to stay. Then the fire tightened. Shells landed with deliberate spacing, walking across the battalion's line methodically. Forward observers adjusted without urgency. When resistance was detected, it was isolated. When a pocket survived, it was sealed. The pattern repeated with mechanical consistency, indifferent to bravery or resolve. Inside the Japanese positions, cohesion began to dissolve, not from panic, but from inevitability. Communication between squads broke down as runners were killed and wires shredded. Ammunition could not be redistributed. Wounded men could not be moved. Each section fought its own battle, cut off from the others, bound to ground that no longer had tactical meaning. When American tanks finally moved forward, they did not rush. They advanced behind artillery, behind infantry, behind certainty. Fixed defenses that might have repelled an assault were now exposed to direct fire at close range. Machine gun nests were crushed. Strong points were bypassed and reduced from the flanks. Positions that had been prepared for weeks were erased in minutes. There was no counterattack. There could not be. The battalion had no reserve, no space to maneuver, no way to regroup. What remained of its strength was consumed where it stood. Within days, the formation ceased to exist as a fighting unit, not because its soldiers lacked courage, but because courage could not compensate for immobility under modern firepower. The ground they had been ordered to hold absorbed everything, their bodies, their weapons, their final resistance, without altering the outcome. For the officer who had made the decision, there was no final revelation, no moment of clarity amid the collapse, only the confirmation of what the war had already decided. His battalion did not slow the American advance. It did not force a pause. It did not change the timetable. It vanished. And with it disappeared the last illusion that fixed defense sustained by will alone, could survive in this kind of war. What followed would reach far beyond that stretch of shattered ground, beyond the fate of one battalion, beyond the consequences of one decision. The loss of a single battalion did not alter the battle in any visible way. That was the problem. From the American perspective, the advance continued on schedule. Units rotated, supply lines flowed. The front moved forward in measured increments, unaffected by the scale of Japanese sacrifice. What had been destroyed on one ridge was simply bypassed on the next. There was no pause to acknowledge resistance that could not impose delay. For the Japanese command, however, the implications were immediate and severe. Saipan was not an isolated outpost. It was a critical link in the inner defensive perimeter, one of the last barriers separating the Japanese home islands from direct aerial attack. Every unit lost, there weakened a system already stretched past its limits. Thousands of trained infantry were consumed in fixed positions that yielded no strategic return. Officers were lost not after prolonged maneuver warfare, but in static defenses that offered the enemy perfect conditions for annihilation. The doctrine that demanded holding ground at all costs produced losses that could not be replaced and bought time that did not matter. As Saipan fell sector by sector, the strategic picture shifted decisively. Once secured, the island would place American long-range bombers within reach of the Japanese mainland. The war would no longer be confined to distant fronts. It would arrive overhead, unopposed, night after night. The decision of one battalion commander did not cause this outcome, but it reflected the mindset that made it inevitable. Across the island, similar choices were being made under the same assumptions, producing the same results. Defensive lines hardened where they should have bent. Units stood where they should have moved. And when they were destroyed, the broader system absorbed the loss without correction. By the time Saipan was fully in American hands, the Japanese defensive strategy had been exposed. Not as insufficiently brave, but as structurally incapable of adapting to a war defined by mobility, coordination, and overwhelming firepower. The collapse on Saipan marked more than a territorial defeat. It marked the end of any realistic buffer between Japan and the full industrial weight of the United States. What followed would not be decided by island garrisons, but by production capacity, air superiority, and endurance on a scale that individual sacrifice could no longer influence. The battalion had been erased quietly. The consequences of its erasure would be felt loudly, and for a very long time. Long after the guns on Saipan fell silent, the decision made by one battalion commander continued to echo, not as a name remembered, but as a pattern repeated. In post-war assessments, the lesson was often framed in terms of technology: tanks over trenches, artillery over courage, mobility over mass. But the deeper failure was not mechanical, it was conceptual. A doctrine built to preserve honor had been asked to survive contact with a form of war that no longer recognized it. The officer on Saipan did exactly what he had been trained to do. He did not panic. He did not abandon his post. He did not seek a way out at the expense of his men. By the standards of his institution, his conduct was correct, and that is what makes the outcome so stark. The war exposed a truth that no amount of personal resolve could obscure. Honor, when rigidly defined, becomes a trap. A code designed to strengthen discipline can, under the wrong conditions, eliminate the very flexibility that allows an army to survive. When doctrine refuses to adapt, it does not produce heroism, it produces predictability. And predictability in modern war is lethal. Saipan marked the moment when that contradiction could no longer be ignored. With the island secured, American bombers would soon depart from its airfields, carrying the war directly to the Japanese mainland. The distance between battlefield decisions and civilian consequence collapsed. What had once been an abstract defensive theory became a tangible national catastrophe. Yet the story is not one of simple condemnation. The officer's failure was not moral, it was historical. He was shaped by a system that had not prepared him for the kind of war he was fighting. His loyalty, unquestioned and absolute, became inseparable from the outcome it helped to produce. In that sense, the battalion did not vanish without meaning. Its destruction marked the end of an era of thinking, a final demonstration that courage alone could not substitute for adaptation. That survival, not sacrifice, would determine what endured beyond the war. History did not remember the officer by name. It remembered the consequences of the belief he carried. And in the silence that followed Saipan, one question lingered longer than the smoke. When honor demands that a man stand still in a war that punishes immobility, is it still honor? Or is it only the echo of a world that no longer exists?